Next, we have Wyllie. He is from Duxbury, Massachusetts, and is a junior majoring in economics. On campus, he is involved with the Economics Association, where he founded their Public Policy Analyst program. He's also a member of the Investment Club and Campus Ministry. Currently, he's working for the governor's office in Massachusetts, but in the past has worked for a private equity firm as well as a community development organization. He studied abroad last semester in Uganda, a formative experience that he hopes to share with you through this talk. Wyllie.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hi, everyone. So thanks for coming out tonight. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little about putting a human face to the matrix of globalization. As John said, last semester, I studied in Uganda. This is a picture from the eastern region in Kapchorwa. While I was there, I did classes for half the time with other students from American universities. And then for the second half, I spent that time in an internship as well as doing research. For the internship, I worked with the Uganda National NGO Forum. And what they do is they represent most of civil society within Uganda. And they work with different bodies and stuff like that. And when I was there, I worked in their Policy and Advocacy Division. At their Policy and Advocacy Division, I was able to work with the National Development Plan and developing recommendations for that. I did presentations for Parliament that I wrote and that other people were able to give. I repeatedly told them that I was not a postdoc student like they thought I was and that I was an undergrad, but they still continued to give me this work. And throughout that, I got a great view of the NGO sector in Uganda. Now, while I was there, I also did research on social enterprise. Now, that research was really cool, and I really enjoyed doing it for the 6 weeks that I was with the NGO Forum, but that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Today, I would like to bring it back down to the people behind the numbers that we often talk about when we're talking about globalization. And with that, we have a few examples that I'd like to share of different people and their stories and how that might relate to numbers. The first example are my two homestay sisters when I was out in the eastern region of Kapchorwa. Their great-grandmother is 93 years old, and I was able to spend a Thursday afternoon with her for an hour, and it was actually at this fellowship that they called it for the local church. Our homestay father was a pastor, and we went and we listened, and at the end we just had a couple of words about why we were there, and it was translated into the local language. Now, after hearing this, the great-grandmother, the grandmother of our homestay father, who again is 93 years old, wanted to quote-unquote spoil us. So she wanted to buy us each a soda. And now here in the US, like that context is not really a big deal. But when you think about it, for her, she's probably not working anymore, and she felt the need to be extremely hospitable to us. And we would often refer to that as, per capita GDP. In the US, per capita GDP is $57,000. And in Uganda, it's only $650. And I can promise you, she wasn't even making that a year. And when you end up in one of these situations, you think that, like, me being there at a privileged American college student, I should be giving to them, not the reverse. But this story unfolded time and time again. We had 3 dinners one night just because all these different villagers wanted to give us dinner. I could not stuff my face any more than I did that night. But that's just like another example of where you have numbers and you have the human face that's actually really behind that. Something else that some of you might be familiar with is the Coca-Cola campaign that started in the 1970s to put a Coke in the hands of everyone in the world. Now, this is a blurry screenshot from the end of one of their old videos. And they talk about how they gathered all these people from all around the world to tell them that the Coke is the real thing and that you should have one. When I was in Kapchorwa, we went to this place called Sippy Falls. And it was this really muddy terrain down this hill to get to it. And this older gentleman from the community in tattered clothes and no shoes was trying to help us as my friends and I tumbled down this muddy hill, like taking each other out as we went. And after all of this, he spent probably about an hour and a half with us. And we never asked him to help us. he came up to me at the end and said, "Money for the soda, money for the soda." That money was 2,000 Ugandan shillings. In US context, that's 50 cents. But when we talk about these emerging markets and Coca-Cola expanding into them, this is what he's talking about. Like, this is actually really what we're talking about. This man needed more food, he needed more clothes, he didn't have any shoes, yet what he was asking me for was money for the soda, not any of that. So when we talk about emerging markets, like we do like in the investment club, this is really what we're talking about. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, but you have to understand what that really means. Otherwise, you can't really make a good informed decision about it. The next example I have actually stems from my research. In my research, I went to a place called In Need Home. And the reason I went there was because they had a program that was funded by a social enterprise, which is what piqued my interest. When I got there, and after I'd finished my interviews, they asked me whether or not I wanted to see some of the homes that these children lived in that they worked with. Now, what they do is they rehabilitate children who are either out of school for medical reasons or for being orphans, and they put them through this program that gives them through primary 1 and primary 2, think first and second grade, and then they pay for the rest of their schooling, which is something that they otherwise wouldn't have. Now, these two children right here, when we left the interview, they both grabbed one hand and the other hand, and they, dragged me across the street, and we went into their home, which is the local slum. Now, in here, you can see, oh, that's not what I meant to do, sorry. You can see this right here is the outhouse they have to use, and you actually have to pay to use it. It's disgusting, but you have to pay 500 Ugandan shillings to use it. So they often have to hold common bodily functions just to not have to pay this or to not go in the street because they have a lot of self-respect and they don't like to do that. These two children, once they ran across ahead of me like this, the director drew me in close and he said, so both of them are 9 years old and they're also HIV positive. Their parents passed away from HIV/AIDS and they're now living with their grandmother. And without this program, we're not really sure what would have happened to them. And in that day, I spent 4 hours there going from home to home. And these homes are not much longer than my wingspan and not much wider than 3 feet in some cases. One of the homes we went to with these children was that of a somewhat related relative who was a 17-year-old girl, and she had 2 children of her own, one of whom had actually passed away that morning, and she's just sitting there sobbing. And it's not that I'm here to just tap into the pathos of this and the emotional and get you to try and go do something. It's really not what I'm looking at. It's really just to begin to understand the context in which they live and how that will then influence our lives and how we interact with them. Now, if we look at this program from the eyes of the numbers again, right? This is a program, it's an indigenous NGO to Uganda. They started it there. It helps 30 kids every 2 years. It's a 2-year program. And then they pay for the rest of their schooling. And to date, they've helped 4,000 children. Now, if you or I were on a website looking at what this means, we go in and we see, oh, it's a very, very small drop in a very, very large bucket. Now, even after knowing all the context, that's still true. But when you know the context, you might be able to make a more informed decision about whether or not you're going to invest in them. Maybe you still aren't, but maybe now you are. And they actually started the social enterprise because investors were pulling out. So this is real. When they see a small drop in a very large bucket and no light at the end of the tunnel, that can be what happens. Our last example comes from our trip to Rwanda. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Rwandan genocide. And when we got there, we spent one whole day going from different genocide museums, memorials, and mass graves. After about the first hour of reading story after story of people being brutally murdered, you become desensitized and numb to it. A lot of you might see that when you look at stuff from the Syrian refugees scrolling through Facebook. But every single one of those people, every single one of those 800,000 people died once, and then another, and then another. It wasn't just one big number. These children lived through it. And when I was there, anyone my age or older, because I was born in 1995, just around the time that the genocide occurred, had lived through it. Everyone we were interacting with on the streets. And that was really hard to fathom. But when you go to these memorials and you feel numb to it, it's very weird. We finally went to one at the very end of the day, and it was a church where there was shrapnel through the ceiling still, bloodstains, clothes still strewn out across the pews. And it was so hard to feel anything because at this point, you'd become immune to it from doing it all day, which is just scary to say. Then we went out back, and there was a small Sunday school that was part of the church. And while we were there, we could hear the laughter and children playing at a local primary school currently. And we're sitting there, and the tour guide is telling us about what went on in the Sunday school during the genocide, and there was this dark stain on the back wall. And what they had done was the genocidaires had taken children that were small enough to pick up and just thrown them against the wall until their death. And even hearing that with the children playing in the background, you were able to, just because of the sheer levity of the issue, like you were able to feel something, don't get me wrong, but you almost felt worse about not feeling something. And it's not to say that we're awful human beings, it's just that you can't fathom that actually happening. It sounds like a horror movie, not something that happened 20 years ago. And I also hate to say this too, but you can, if someone's dog dies, you almost feel worse because you can think about what that must be like because you can put yourself in their shoes. And that's something we don't often talk about, but in this context, it's almost impossible to really understand what those people went through, even as much as we would like to try. And like I said before, it was 800,000 people that died in this genocide, but I'd prefer to look at it as 80 Boston College populations, not to try and be morbid in our community, but it's just something that might be a little bit easier to digest and understand what that might actually look like, instead of just one blanket number to account for every one of those individuals. Now, with these 4 stories, what am I really trying to get at? I know this might look a little strange, but in your day-to-day lives, right, you can appreciate all of the intricacies, all of the transactions, all of the people you interact with, and you understand how complex it is, like a spider web. Like you understand how everything connects, who you're interacting with, who you got lunch with, who you're now going to study, what test is coming up, what political election is happening, who's protesting what. You understand how infinitely complex that is. Yet then when we extrapolate it out to the developing world, we'll take cookie cutter examples from one place and just apply them to another. Like what works in Switzerland might not work in the US, and we can pretty much appreciate that. But when we get to the developing world, it's not quite the same. And I think that's really important that when we take our complexities and we start channeling them through USAID, which is the aid organization for the US, and we look at other international NGOs that we might donate to, that does bring it down and condense it. But when it gets back into the context of Uganda, Rwanda, or another developing country, that it needs to get complex again, and that it is complex. They may live simpler lives, they might be poverty-stricken, but that doesn't make their lives any less complex. And I think that is something extremely important. The last thing is a chainsaw, and I like to use this analogy because it's hitting on a similar theme, but when you go into surgery, you want a doctor using a scalpel, not a chainsaw. You want him to treat each organ differently and cut out different things depending on what's wrong or depending on what organ it is. You don't want him coming in with a chainsaw. And in the same context, when we're looking at the developing world or looking at just helping out another person, we want to do the same thing. You want to use a scalpel and not a chainsaw. And then lastly, I'll end with this. The secret of success is to understand the point of view of others, and that's from Henry Ford. I wasn't going to put this in, but when I actually gave my talk at Notre Dame about social enterprise, the research I had done, this was the slide that was left up at the end, because at the end of my presentation, for kind of a different reason. But a gentleman, very much at the end, the first question right at the gate was in response to this quote. And he goes, but what if they don't even want it? Like, how do we know that they actually want it? And the crowd kind of took a big gasp, like, how could they not want it? People need some of these resources we're trying to provide them. But I think it's actually a question we don't ask enough, in the sense of not necessarily whether or not they need it, they might need it, but how do we go about doing it? Are we doing the right thing? Just because it has a lot of money doesn't mean it's necessarily the right answer. Every time you interact in a developing country, every time you interact with someone, you have an influence. If it's free, you still have an influence. If it's $1 million, you still have an influence. I think sometimes people zoom out and feel like as an outsider, you're not actually a part of that community, so you can't have a negative impact, but in some cases you can. And to leave it on a more positive note, I think that with these examples, people are very welcoming, especially in Uganda and other places, to get to know their stories. All you really have to do is ask. And understanding that context could really help us have a better impact in the world. Thank you.